The vessel. In Art and Agency, Alfred Gell writes that all around the world and in numerous different places and epochs, artificial objects have been made not only to represent spiritual entities, but also to instantiate them. These objects, often used in rituals or otherwise consulted on important matters, are or have been assumed by their human counterparts to be thinking things, to be in possession of a soul, to have inner light. So what do these man-made avatars of spirit look like? There is, of course, a lot of diversity. Some are shaped anthropomorphically, figuratively representing the deities or spirits that they incorporate. Some are more abstract in form, spherical, cylindrical, or cuboid, sometimes adorned with symbols. Yet there is a cross-cultural design feature common to them, and that is that they tend to be hollow or have some sort of orifice. Gell calls this the homunculus effect, suggesting that animacy can be achieved in non-anthropomorphic figures so long as the crucial feature of concentricity and containment is preserved. Similarly, writing on the 16th century European practice of making anatomical wax figures, Marina Warner explains that anatomists were not queasy about studying cadavers by using the most invasive means, justifying their curiosity with the belief that once the soul had departed, the body left behind was only an empty husk. Emma Claire Brownlee argues that this view of the cadaver in Europe may have begun around the 7th century AD, correlating it to the Christian concept of the afterlife of the soul and its effect on burial practices. And she says, the abandonment of grave goods in the 7th century across most of Western Europe suggests a change in the way the corpse was perceived from an embodied, active social agent to an empty vessel which had ceased to be the locus of personhood. In Europe, the belief in the ephemerality of the flesh and immortality of spirit has been largely influenced by Christianity, but the intuitive configuration of spirit within body seems to have been relatively universal, according to Gell. The results of a recent study I conducted on diagramming the self provided further evidence suggesting that the vessel continues to be the most prevalent shape used to model self in the human imagination, underpinned by the instinct that an inner life requires interiority, a space in which the implied kernel of selfhood is housed. Interiority is a mark of soulfulness, of a thinking thing. Is the soul contained? Are thoughts sequestered like moths caught fluttering in a jar? Does the mind flit and spark internally like a light bulb? Are memories collected and stored like papers in a filing cabinet? Is the vessel, when taken to be the shape of a thinking thing, misleading or telling? On the one hand, yes. When I look into another creature's eyes, I judge their soulfulness by the depth of their gaze and seem to find a fellow inmate hidden in the hollow behind them. On the other hand, the vessel sends me searching inside that other's eye, searching for a kernel of selfhood hidden within the interior, a sacred space in which the true other can be found. But a homunculus model like this only perpetuates the problem of locating intelligence by infinite regress, becoming an intellectual matryoshka doll whereby each homunculus opens into another and so on. So the problem with this belief that yourself is coming from a point within you, this belief that there is a kind of a homunculus or like a mini you inside your body that is controlling the apparatus of your body, that is from whence your will and intention springs. The problem with this idea that there is almost like a miniature you inside you is that it doesn't solve the question of agency or how it works, because it begs then the question, how do we explain the agency of that homunculus? So that's what I meant by infinite regress, and that's why I call this an intellectual matryoshka doll in the case of talking about selfhood, because you could posit a homunculus inside the self as the source of the self, but then you could almost open up that homunculus and put a homunculus inside that homunculus, and on and on and on. So it doesn't really answer the problem of agency, or it doesn't really explain agency, it just defers the question. So, going back to where we were, it has often been intuited that one could eventually, through this process of peeling back layers, reach a point at which the origin of volition is located, as communicated in the following observation by Erving Goffman. And he says, in our society, the character one performs and oneself are somewhat equated, and this self as character is usually seen as something housed within the body of its possessor, especially the upper parts thereof, being a nodule somehow in the psychobiology of personality. We can call this configuration of self as a point within a vessel pointhood. In Freedom Evolves, Daniel Dennett explains that in problems of infinite regress, there often lies the philosophical temptation to invoke a buck stopper. We try to find where the buck stops when we try to identify, for example, which species in the chain of biological evolution was the first mammal, giving rise to all subsequent mammals. The endeavour to identify the prime mammal in a system like evolution, which is characterised by change occurring in gradations, is, however, another one of those instances where a question appears to be paradoxical when it is actually just founded on the wrong assumption to begin with. There is no such thing as a prime mammal because there is no such thing as a category called mammal, which evolution itself must adhere to in order to drive changes in species. Mammal is but another model, a convenience for economizing our way through a data-rich world, and it has its affordances and costs. Similarly, we might look at the vessel model of self and wonder where the buck stops. By how many degrees does the matryoshka doll of self open until we arrive at the final source of will and agency? No matter how far down you go, you can't stop infinite regress by invoking a prime mammal, by inventing a special difference that is essential but invisible. Quoting Dennett there. The pointhood model is pervasive, and a useful example of it is cited by Dennett. In a neurophysiological experiment by Benjamin Libet, it was shown that there is a 300 millisecond gap between the point at which participants report that they made a spontaneous conscious decision to press a button and the point at which their brain's readiness potential was activated. And just to read you the footnote here so that you know, readiness potential is a sudden surge of detectable activity in the brain. And the experiment assumes that readiness potential is the point at which an action is initiated in the brain. So going back to this experiment, so this is what was shown, that there's a 300 millisecond gap between the point at which participants say, hey, I'm making a decision now to press a button, and their brain's readiness potential being activated. This meant that participants typically reported their decision happening circa 300 milliseconds after the brain had already set in motion enacting that decision, leading many scholars in the neuroscience community to conclude that we do not really have free will, but are rather under the illusion that we have made a decision when our brain has in fact already made it for us, because they were seeing in this experiment that the brain was already preparing to push this button before the participants themselves first became aware and reported that they made that decision. Dennett finds several ways to problematize this conclusion, but the main point of interest to us here is how it raises the problem of locating the self in the brain, a spatiotemporal problem of shape and modeling. As Dennett remarks, where you are becomes significant if you want to register consciousness by measuring speed. Libet's experiment, or more specifically, the conclusion that agents do not really have free will, presupposes that you, the you that makes the decisions and is conscious, is located in a single point, presumably somewhere in the brain, in what Dennett calls the Cartesian theatre, waiting on the input from the brain that will ultimately colour your decision. However, Dennett argues that there is no reason to suggest that such a point in time and space exists. Rather, it is much more likely that you, yourself, is distributed in time and space, and that in fact, decisions are essentially temporal and spatial events, not instantaneous nor confined within a point. And he says, once you distribute the work done by the homunculus, in this case, decision-making, clock watching, and decision simultaneity judging, in both space and time in the brain, you have to distribute the moral agency around as well. You are not out of the loop. You are the loop. You are that large. You are not an extensionless point. Even if we simply confined our definition of mind to the contours of a brain, the brain matter and brain activity too are vastly distributed in time and space. And when we examine the brain's architecture, it refuses the expectation of centralization that we so casually bring to our reading of mind. Dennett shows that to conclude from Libet's experiment that we do not really have free will depends on a particular model that locates the kernel of self within a point, just as the finite, infinite Earth debate depended on a flat Earth model. While I do not suggest that we should now dismiss that model, there may well be valid insights that come with this intuition of centrality. Dennett's criticism does invite us to try to come up with other kinds of models that might shape our implicit theories of self-mechanics differently. What I would add to Dennett's commentary of Libet's experiment is that the very scientific desire for precision and the way precision itself is conceptualized or aestheticized might also be forming our assumptions about the shape of a thinking thing, of a self. When we think of precision, we tend to think of something like acupuncture, whose needles lead us in search of a point. But what if the shape of a thinking thing calls for a different kind of tool? In other words, not only can we get the shape of a phenomenon wrong to start with, but sometimes the very tools with which we approach it presume that shape for us. The discerning needle pinpoints, and in the case of Libet's experiment, the very precision tactics employed in it, the clock, the spontaneous report, mean that the very sharpness of the discerning tool blunts our understanding. Here are some of the shortcomings of the vessel model and its attendant pointhood. 1. it does not take into account the social milieu into which self is steeped and attempts to account for self without others. 2. It does not provide a mechanism for mimetic contagion and thus essentializes the self. So it does not provide us with an explanation for how self is influenced by the behaviors of other selves. It seems to suggest that the way a self is comes from some inner essence, but then that inner essence is kind of miraculous. There's no kind of explanation for it. 3. It shrouds the ghostly properties of self in mystery by relegating self to a vanishing point by infinite regress. So it makes the self seem like this mysterious thing that can't be studied, that is just kind of this special source within us that can never be reached, because it is an explanation that takes the form of infinite regress. We'll never be able to reach it. It regresses infinitely. These shortcomings will be addressed in sections 2.2 and 2.3, and alternative models will be considered. However, before we go on, I've been critical of the vessel model and this idea of the self as a point within this vessel. The vessel shape does bring with it some intuitions that should not necessarily be dismissed, and that's what we're going to look at now. So the first kind of useful possible property of the vessel model is it alerts us to these characteristics of hiddenness and attenuation in self. So a key characteristic of agents is that they make other agents wait and see what they will do. There is a subtle unpredictability in their actions. Once the agent decides to do something, for example, talk about what they want to do tomorrow, we can see their resultant actions, but not their causes. So this entire section is a credit to my father Miloš Ranković's work, and we're going to delve into it a little bit more, but just to expand that observation there, if you're having a conversation with me, and here I am just being an agent, just kind of telling you about what I'm going to be doing tomorrow, all you can see is my resulting actions, me telling you what I'm going to do tomorrow, me talking, but you can't see the causes behind my resultant actions. Now, this attenuated property of agency is discussed by Miloš Ranković in his PhD dissertation, where he proposes the shape of the neuron as a model for describing agential mechanisms. So a simplified model of a neuron can be described as a channel with lots and lots of inputs and only one output. If you look at a drawing of a neuron, a simple way of picturing a neuron would be, this channel with lots and lots of inputs coming in, but just one output. While lots of signals of various strengths can go into a neuron, the neuron must attenuate all this information into one single output. Following Dennett, Ranković notes that the elaborate causal structure that kicks into motion the agent's unfolding decision is itself distributed, but the output, that is the agent's action or decision, is singular. Now that's quite a key observation. So when you look at me being me, when you're watching me being an agent, it appears as though my actions are singular because I'm just doing one thing. I'm not doing a lot of things. I'm telling you one thing that I want to do tomorrow. I'm providing you with a singular presentation of myself. But what you don't see is that the causal structure behind my utterance is itself vastly distributed. It's just that through my personhood, through myself, all this vast causal structure is attenuated into a single output. So from your perspective, it looks like I'm singular, but what's behind me is much vaster and distributed, and that's what you don't see. So, since we, observing the agent, sit on the outside of this unfolding, distributed process, since it is hidden from us, we only have the endpoint of the agent's behavior upon which to judge its mechanics. Thus, because an agent only ever delivers a single observable output, and because its inputs are hidden from view, it looks as if the cause of the action came from a singular origin too, giving rise to the impression of pointhood. This is a really great observation. So because you are not seeing the elaborate causal structure behind my actions, and because they're hidden from view, and I'm attenuating them into a single output, because you're seeing my actions and presentation of self as singular, it leads you to believe, it looks as if my singular actions are coming from a singular source. But it's just that through the machinery of my being, I'm collapsing all that causality into singularity. And that's a really great explanation, I think, for why we intuit that there's an internal essence attributed to our expressions and behaviors. Although pointhood provides a flawed model of self, given that it is difficult to explain how volition can spontaneously arise out of thin air, the vessel model does highlight the crucial observation that causes of agent behavior are profoundly hidden, even if their hiding place is not the cage of the skull alone. So we'll leave that for now, but what is interesting, and what Miloš Ranković does point out in his own work, is that there's something about this hiddenness that is extremely agentic. So not only is it true that you can't see the causal structure behind my behavioral outputs, that's true, but what's also true is that I seem agent-like to you because of that hiddenness. That there's something about this hiddenness that is deeply related to agentness as well. That what we feel to be an agent is partly wrapped up in this characteristic of causality being hidden from view. So it appears as if the actions of this agent spring from something centralized. So now let's look at another useful aspect of the vessel model and thinking about selves as vessels. And this comes more from Alfred Gell. So this term, a procession of skins, comes from his book Art and Agency. In presenting the pervasiveness of concentricity in modeling agency as a vessel, Gell asks us not to dismiss infinite regress too quickly. We may not necessarily only read the concentric layers of the homunculus effect inwardly towards a presumed center point of the self, but also outwardly. He cites Egyptian idols as examples of figures that were themselves hollow, vessel-like, with inlaid eyes, but then also points out that these figures were in turn enclosed in arcs and then in temples with concentric layers of rooms extending outwardly. The homunculus effect here emanates both inwardly and outwardly, and it is not quite certain where the authentic layer of personhood is located. The skin or boundary of the agent can be formulated differently depending on the level at which the distributed object is being perceived. We can then consider whether the point is not actually to ever arrive at the supposed authentic layer, whether deep in the center of the mind or out at the scale of temples or traditions. Rather, we could model animacy precisely as a procession of skins. It's a really unique idea, I think. And so here's Alfred Gell talking about agency potentially as this something that emanates. So he says, we must enter these holes, the ubiquitous orifices of animated idols. And then what would we find? Who can say, and does it matter? For by now it is apparent that the animation of the image is not a matter of finding the sacred centre at all. What matters is only the reduplication of skins, outwards towards the macrocosm and inwards towards the microcosm, and the fact that all these skins are structurally homologous. There is no definitive surface, there is no definitive inside, but only a ceaseless passage in and out, and that it is here in this traffic of to and fro that the mystery of animation is solved. Through exploring some of the affordances and blindnesses of the vessel model, as well as the related concepts of agency as pointhood, attenuation, and a procession of skins, we have occasionally come across the notion of a distributed self. This arguably more abstract shape is the next model of self I will consider.